When it comes to singular years in drag racing history that heavily impacted the sport, 1965 is really tough to top. From the weekly evolution of funny cars to the incredible experimentation being done with dragsters, aerodynamics, and frankly everything else, 1965 has a little something for everyone. In fact, it actually had something for me as a kid decades after it happened. I was going through my dad's old magazines and I happened upon a photo of a car. It was this car, Nye Frank's Pulsator, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. How could it not, right? The body, the canopy, the fact that it looked like a spaceship, and then I came to find out the thing had 2 engines, and it ran on nitromethane. Back then, it was the extent of my knowledge in the car. I had a lot to learn. I didn't know who the legendary Nye Frank was. I was unaware of what he had already accomplished, what he was doing at the time while running this car and a second dragster, and certainly didn't know who he would eventually become in the world of American motorsports. I also didn't know that this whole idea of aerodynamics was a burgeoning field in drag racing at this time, and it was not being executed by scientists, but rather by hot rodders who seemed, or at least believed, they knew they could identify a fast shape by sight or by intuition. History being a guide, they didn't. And while a lot of positive was pulled from this era of experimentation, many dead ends were explored to their frustrating fullest. So before we get into the whole interesting story of the Pulsator, there were a couple of other swoopy dragsters that had the fans' eyes bulging in 1965 as well. At this time, there were dozens of quote-unquote streamliners out there, but for the interest of time, I'll mention just the most notable pair that were at the 1965 Winter Nationals with the Pulsator. The first one is one of the most gorgeous dragsters ever constructed. The Scrima-Liner Scrima-Liner debuted at Lyons Drag Strip in August of 1964. Ronnie Scrima at Exhibition Engineering built the car, with George Baselak and Bob Sorrell crafted the amazing aluminum body. Don Alderson of Mylodon Engineering did the engine, which was a blown 392 Hemi on nitromethane. So why did they cover everything on this car but the engine? After some thought, the group decided that having the engine in the open was a safer option than having it stuck under the body, where the driver could also be trapped with fire and flying oil and parts, allowing things to, well, evacuate themselves into the atmosphere seemed like the safer idea. This car was very well thought out, and perhaps that was one of its problems. The car was built in a very robust fashion in order to handle the thousands of miles a national tour would bring and many runs down rough drag strips around the country, and so it was heavy before the body was even put on the chassis. I wish I were in the room when this car was scaled, because it weighed 1,600 pounds, and in terms of a dragster of this era, it was a tank. Accordingly, it kind of ran like one. 814 at 191 miles an hour with the body on, and the car did drive and handle well, but the weight just couldn't be overcome. Shedding the body? Well, that put the car down in the 770s at over 200. Despite the somewhat disappointing performance, it was still one of the most beautiful dragsters ever built. The second really dramatic-looking dragster at this particular race, the 1965 Winter Nationals, had an additional twist. The engine was in the back. Tony Nancy's AA dragster, which competed in the top gas category, was wild. Called the Wedge, the car was built by Frank Huzzer and Roy Steen at RCS Race Cars. Wayne Ewing created the body from scratch, and believe it or not, Nancy actually had 2 of these things. The first was destroyed in July of 1964 in Ohio, the result of an insane top-end wreck where the car performed an endo at speed. Nancy hung with this program, and the car you see here at the 65 Winter Nationals was both competitive and cool. Some changes were made with the second car to help vent air from under the body, reducing its want to fly away at the top end. The Wedge 2 didn't have a lot of national event victories or glory to brag on, but it did do something else of importance. In the middle of 1965, Tony Nancy shipped this car to Monza, Italy, and decimated a lot of FIA acceleration records, the largest of which was going from 0 to 195 miles an hour in 400 yards. Nancy shipped the car home, ran it briefly, and then parked it for decades. He did restore this car before he passed away about 20 years ago. The Wedge had more accomplishments than the majority of other streamliners. But let's get back to the main subject of this story, the Pulsator. As you can imagine, a car like this doesn't just spring from the mind of a guy without some prior provocation. The impetus came from years leading up to 1965 and the success that Nye Frank and John Peters had had together with a car originally called the Quincy Automotive Special, but by 1965 was now universally known as the Freight Train. It was then and would remain until the end of the Top Gas era the premier machine in that category of drag racing. When first constructed, the car used a pair of small block Chevy engines that actually shared a single supercharger. The next evolution of the car saw each engine getting its own supercharger and the horsepower rising. Bob Moravez drove it, and by 1963, it had pretty much won everything it could have possibly won at will. The combination of the 2 engines linked end-to-end with a sprocket chain-style coupler was the perfect union, and they had one other trick up their sleeve. While the freight train may have been heavier than the single-engine competition, it made enough torque that it was capable of using the largest top fuel slick available at the time. Most top gas cars with a single engine had to use a smaller tire because they didn't have enough power to pull that big slick down the racetrack. The bigger tire and their ability to plant the power made the freight train unstoppable. Wanting to continue the freight train's success, Nye Frank had an idea for a top fuel car that would be different than all the rest. He'd employ all the best attributes of the freight train and top gas, but he'd be able to solve a massive issue that top fuel racers suffered from an era of engines filled with a lot of stock parts: reliability. By using two injected nitro-burning 364 cubic inch small block Chevy engines, he could make 1,800 horsepower out of two 900 horsepower engines versus the 12 to 1,400 he estimated his opponents were making with one single failure-prone Hemi. He also decided that the car needed an aerodynamic body to help cheat the wind and win. The small block Chevy engines used 3 5/8 inch stroke Mickey Thompson crankshafts, and remember, we're starting with 327s here as the 350 had not yet come on the market. There were Mickey Thompson pistons and rods, Mondello cylinder heads with 2-inch intake valves and 1 5/8 exhaust valves. Chet Herbert supplied not only roller camshafts, but the whole engines themselves, as he was as interested in this experiment as Nye Frank was. The power of the two engines was sent through a twin-disc 11-inch Schiefer clutch to a Hallobrand quick-change rear end, which used a 3:31 gear ratio. One feature of this car that got the attention of many was what we would now call a puke tank. A stainless steel tank was filled with steel wool and hooked to the engines, designed to catch any water, oil, or other blow-by that would come through the valve covers. Now, to give you an idea on Nye Frank, as they were mangling people with the freight train, as he was conceiving this concept and executing it with his own two hands, he was also the crew chief for Craig Breedlove's Spirit of America land speed car. That iconic machine was built to battle hammer and tong with Art Arfons for the outright land speed world record. Of course, Breedlove would achieve that goal. Frank was a truly brilliant guy who was out to prove again that he not only had a better idea for a drag racing machine, but he had the best idea of the era. The chassis of the car used a 137-inch wheelbase and was virtually identical to the freight trains, with one interesting difference. The steering layout was changed to prevent the drag link from being exposed outside of the body, so rather than having it connect to the left side of the front end as was common practice in a dragster, Frank had it routed inward to the center of the front axle. The drag link now ran basically over the engines to the front of the car with the use of some universal joints. The result was a much more responsive steering system with far less bending, binding, and flexing than a regular dragster. By all accounts, the handling was never an issue with this machine. The two nitro-injected small block Chevy engines were installed and the car was tested. It ran competitive numbers in the 7-second bracket with speeds over 200 miles an hour. These early tests, which were made without the body on the chassis, led Nye Frank to believe that this idea might not only be competitive, but it should be a front-runner. Working with Bobby Davids, the two designed and constructed the full envelope body you see here. Designed in two pieces as an upper and lower half, the top could be removed to service the engines and various mechanical systems on the car. Interestingly, they did not use the normal process to make this body. Rather than use plaster or clay over a wooden buck, the two used polyurethane foam, which was shaped and molded and ground down to make the shape for the body of the Pulsator. Being a new process at the time, Davids and Frank were mum on how they actually pulled this job off, and they actually started a business to attract others to this method. With the body, the 1,550-pound car now weighed 1,670 pounds. That was a gain of 120. Despite the car now crossing the scales at basically the same weight as the single-engine Scrima-Liner we talked about before, Frank thought that the slipperier nature of the body would make up for the weight gain with its superior aerodynamics. What does not seem to be accounted for is the additional weight added in tubing, brackets, and tabs to actually hold the body on the chassis. If there was one major deviation in the chassis of the Pulsator from the chassis of the freight train, it was moving the driver's position even further rearward than is normally found in a slingshot. Yes, the driver was behind the axle, but the driver was even further back behind that same axle. That elongated driver position made some additional challenges to get the fitment of the body right. The lateral stability of the car was one of the major concerns of both Davids and Frank, so what they decided to do was extend the body far behind the driver. To understand exactly how far, know that this machine had a wheelbase of about 13 feet and an overall length of 21 feet. While the Pulsator is a perfect example of 1960s eyeball aerodynamics, the men were conscious to make the body with some basic principles in mind. The first was to combat lift. This was done by sloping the nose down. Beyond sloping the nose down, the layout of the front end used some trick components to get it as low as possible and prevent mass quantities of air to run under the body itself. Despite this, the first few runs were very sketchy in this car. The machine was trying to pull the rear tires off the ground at the top end. Modifications were made to combat those, and they were done immediately. Louvers were added to remove pressurized air from underneath the body of the car. Cutouts were added for channeling air down by the slicks to create some downforce as well. These moves immediately negated the rear-end lift situation that really got the attention of Bob Moravez. Well, almost negated that issue. See, one night at Lions Drag Strip, Moravez made a run, released the parachute, and some of the lines somehow got tangled in the internal body structure of the car. This caused the rear end of the dragster to be lifted up nearly vertical at speed and then violently dropped, smashing the car to the ground and smashing the oil pans flat to the crankshafts. It also smashed any hopes that the Pulsator would be a successful venture. The car was effectively done. But interestingly, history will show us something else. The main issue with the Pulsator's performance was not due to the body or its aerodynamics or the lack thereof, but the performance problems came from the engines. The fact that the Pulsator could not run the big numbers needed to be competitive in top fuel wasn't because the body was slowing the car down, it was because something was hidden in the machine that they didn't realize until they built the Pulsator II. The Pulsator II had a better chassis, it had the same engines. It did not have a body, and therefore it didn't have any excuses to underperform. What Nye Frank and his team learned from this car explained all they needed to know about the original full-bodied Pulsator. The same two small blocks from the original Pulsator were linked end-to-end with a chain coupler that locked both cranks together, just as they were in the Pulsator I. Something interesting happened though. The 364 cubic inch, 900 horsepower small block simply couldn't get along. The more tame, blown gas motors in the freight train sung like a choir together, but these two small blocks were absolutely not neighborly. As it turns out, despite the fact that the engines were linked together end-to-end, the rear engine would never quite keep up with the front and would exhibit rough bearing wear and other internal problems that would indicate that the engine was not going to last very long, if not even another run. The team then decided to switch the back engine to the front and the front to the back to see what would happen, and the result was exactly the same. The rear engine was beaten to pieces by the time they were done running on that particular day. Chet Herbert, who supplied the engines, decided he needed to investigate this problem, so both engines were placed on his dyno, one at a time at first. Each engine made 900 horsepower. Then both engines were linked together and placed on the dyno as they were running the car. The result? It made 950 horsepower. It was basically like the second engine wasn't there at all. So instead of 1,800 horsepower, the car was perhaps making 1,000 horsepower on its best day. A short-lived set of experiments at the track using very high-powered Grant ignition systems, a battery-powered ignition, and some other ideas would not prove successful, and the car was effectively parked. The team had chased a few other blind holes that led to nowhere. They were frustrated, and the Pulsator line of dragsters would come to a halt at number 2. So what became of the body of the original Pulsator? Well, that car went on the show circuit for a short while before making its way back home and being sold. One of the owners after Nye Frank decided to keep the chassis and sell the body to a well-known car builder. That guy's name? George Barris. Barris modified the body and placed it on top of a chassis in one of his strangest builds ever, and that's saying something for George Barris. What was it? A snowmobile called the Ice Cutter. Yeah. The Pulsator was an awesome 1960s drag racing experiment that just didn't live up to the hype that many people saw in it early on. Such was the nature of the drag racing business at this time in history. The levels of risk and reward were both very high during this era of drag racing history, and for those that succeeded, the rewards were huge. Nye Frank would cement his legacy in drag racing, land speed racing, and become a Hall of Fame part of off-road racing as well. He was a man who saw things others didn't, and who had the wherewithal to try them with his own two hands. Nye Frank was truly a talent beyond measure through his entire fantastic racing career that spanned the decades. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historical, automotive, and racing content.